Welcome to Real Turkey channel. This is your loving, friendly host, Atilla Shalara. Today, we're going to do diplomacy, Turkey's foreign policy, but we're going to approach the problem from the business end. In other words, we're going to look at Turkey's diplomatic partners and their perspective on regional policy issues. Obviously, this is a subject of immense magnitude with which I cannot cover by myself. So I've invited a very distinguished scholar and my mentor, Mr. Soli Ozel, who is a distinguished faculty member at the prestigious private university in Istanbul Kadir Has. He has also been a visiting lecturer and scholar at several Ivy League universities, which I shall not mention here, as well as in France and in UK, if I'm correct. He has so many distinguished awards that I cannot mention them all here. Soli, welcome to our program. How are you doing today?
Welcome, Attila Bey. Good to be with you, and thanks for inviting me. And thanks for this exaggerated opening. It really boosts my ego.
You can look him up at Google. I haven't even said a tenth of it. Soli, let's start with Israel and Palestine. Even though there is a ceasefire, both sides claim victory, and I think both sides made it pretty sure that this is not the end of hostilities. More importantly, from Turkey's perspective, this is not a closed chapter for Mr. Erdogan. So let me start with two questions. A, is peaceful coexistence still possible between the nations of Israel and the Palestinians? Two, is it Bibi Netanyahu that is the biggest obstacle to peace of any kind? Or has Israel or the Palestinians changed?
Well, I'll start with the second one, which I think is relatively easier. There is no doubt that Bibi Netanyahu did probably more than many others to kill the prospects of what everybody thinks is the only kind of fair and viable solution, which is the two-state solution. He has catered to the Israeli right in order to remain in power. Under his watch, Israeli settlements have expanded, but he did not start it, and others, even someone like Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the Oslo agreements with the PLO, with the late Yasser Arafat. In his time, there was an acceleration in the building of settlements. So Bibi Netanyahu is not by himself an obstacle to a resolution of this conflict or to find a viable and relatively fair solution, but he contributed a lot to it. Your deeper question, the first one is, can these two nations live together? Increasingly, the prospect of a two-state solution is getting more and more remote. In fact, perhaps impossible, according to some scholars, mainly because the Israeli settlement policy made it impossible for the Palestinians to have a reasonably apportioned land on which they can build a state. Therefore, many people today talk about a one-state moment, if not a one-state solution, which is also a very difficult thing to attain, but a one-state moment because between the river and the sea, there is one hegemonic power, Israel, and between the river and the sea, the populations are equally divided. And what the last 11-day war showed to us was that there was no longer a division between Gaza, West Bank, and Israel proper, where 20% of the citizens are Israeli Palestinians or Israeli Arabs who have relatives in both Gaza and the West Bank. It's for the first time since they have become Israeli citizens at the end of the war, because they stayed, they did not leave, or they were not pushed out. The Palestinians have actually demonstrated themselves against the right-wing thugs that came their way in mixed cities. And I think politically, that episode meant we are now in a very, very different political moment. And Palestinian national identity is going to be far more assertive. And that's what I think pushed the Biden administration very reluctantly to step in. Again, you know your history well. You know what Trotsky said about war. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And for Biden, you can paraphrase it and say, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you and will not let you go. So that's where we are. But I think we are in a different moment. Everybody left the Palestinian issue for dead, especially after the so-called Abraham Accords, whereby Israel Israel started diplomatic relations with 4 Arab countries, none of which, by the way, are on Israel's borders, and already 2, Jordan and Egypt, that are Israel's neighbors, signed peace treaties and have diplomatic relations with Israel. Everybody thought, therefore, that in the new configuration, Israel and the Arab countries have a common interest, and that is the containment of Iran. And the Palestinian issue no longer mattered. The Palestinians begged to differ and actually made themselves present again. And I don't think they can be ignored as they were in the past few years.
I'm not going to say I'm an expert on the demographics of the region, but if I understand it correctly, in a decade, maybe even in a shorter time period, the Palestinians in between the river and the sea, as you call it so adroitly, are going to exceed the number of Israelis. How do you solve such a problem? I mean, you can't, God forbid, you can't kill all these people. You can't push them out into exile. There's no place to go. And they're clearly unhappy with the way they're governed. What do you do in a situation like this?
Well, again, I think there was a point when you could have had a 2-state solution. How much either side truly wanted it is debatable, but Israel's legendary chief of staff, Yitzhak Rabin, the one who won the Six-Day War in 1967, who was a hardliner, who was the defense minister during the first Intifada in 1980, the architect of the might and punishment. He came around in 1993 and signed a deal with the Palestine Liberation Organization because he saw that the Palestinians were not going to go anywhere. The Cold War was over, a new state was starting. And he was the person probably in Israel who could have sold the 2-state solution to his own people because he was both trusted and a former military man. And guess what happened? He was murdered after an incredible attack on him by the Israeli right wing who portrayed him as Hitler reincarnate. He was murdered by an Israeli right winger. And nobody with his clout existed who could actually carry the process further. And then the second Intifada and Hamas's 2 waves of terrorism in 95, 96, and then in 2000 to 2002, that actually killed all prospects. It killed the Israeli peace camp, which gave some signs of recovering, but they are very weak today. And we're left with, as what I said before, that is, we are now in a 1-state moment, which is truly very difficult to attain and to make operate. The demographic thing is a bit complicated because for a long time now, everybody said that the Palestinian Arab population would exceed the Jewish population in Palestine, in Holy Lands. That hasn't yet come, but there's now an equality. And many people never really counted Israel's own Arab citizens as part of that equation. But now, as I said, they are part of the equation. You don't solve this issue, you can manage it. You'll have to be much more creative than saying, we will continue with our settlements, damn the Palestinians, and we'll squeeze them. And you can also, and you would also, and on the Palestinian side, they will have to give up those, if there are people who entertain the thought that Israel would disappear, it will not disappear. Somehow a much more imaginative way of dealing with this should be found. The World Bank, back in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, actually started doing preparing a lot of reports to figure out if a Palestinian state would be economically feasible. The only way a Palestinian state would be economically feasible would be in a confederative arrangement with Jordan, but definitely an economy integrated with the Jordanian and the Israeli economies. Maybe along those lines, a new political configuration could be found, because otherwise, a two-state solution as things exist today means, or can only happen if the hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank accept to become Palestinian citizens when the Palestinian state is founded. And but you know, there is a way around that, of course, because 80% of the settlers live in 3% of the land that was occupied. So you would have an exchange of land as well. But first of all, you've got to rebuild trust. There are no honest brokers. It's been a long time since the United States has been considered an honest broker. Quite frankly, I don't think the Russians or the Chinese care all that much. So this will have to be managed, and it will have to be managed much more humanely on the part of the Israelis. They will really have to stop expanding, and they will also have to be much more considerate about the citizenship rights of their own Arab citizens, because that genie is also out of the bottle.
Do you think that this never-ending conflict and very bitter conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians stokes the broader conflict between fundamentalist Muslims and the Christians or other religions, in fact? Or is it just an excuse for terrorists who claim to be fundamentalist Islam, Muslims?
First of all, look, because the most recent violence erupted in Jerusalem and around the Al-Aqsa, its sacredness and whatever, and on all that. This overtones of the conflict had become more century, perhaps. But look, political Islam as a political management program has failed miserably almost everywhere. Wow. For instance, Hamas is popular in the West Bank because the rulers of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, is utterly corrupt, doesn't manage anything, and is totally devoid of energy, political energy. There are a few people in the West Bank who can actually lead the Palestinians much better. One of them is in jail and the others are not being given a chance. So you would say Hamas is popular, Hamas is an Islamist party, it is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But if you are to ask the Gazans what they think about Hamas, Hamas has also mismanaged Gaza. They've been controlling Gaza since 2007, and it was not inconceivable that if the elections could have been held and the Palestinian Authority again canceled them once more, Hamas maybe would have won in the West Bank, but would have lost in Gaza, because in Gaza people are sick and tired of their corruption, of their repression, and their imposition of their lifestyle on everyone else. But obviously Jerusalem, Al-Quds, is sacred for all three monotheistic religions. The passions flare up when the issue is around Jerusalem. And therefore, Islamist movements all over will continue to use this until and unless there is a settlement. But the issue for me is mainly political, not really religious, but it serves both the purposes of the Israeli right and the let's say, Muslim fundamentalists in Palestine to actually to discuss it or to debate it that way.
Let's move on to the Turkish angle. Mr. Erdogan was the most avid supporter of the Palestinian cause. And correct me if I'm wrong in this observation. He seemed to be more interested in defending Palestinians and their rights than the Arab states. And even though there's a ceasefire, he hasn't stopped his request for Palestinian equality and protection, etc., etc. He doesn't show the same kind of empathy for Uyghurs in China. Why is that so? What is Erdogan's stake in fighting for Palestinians?
Okay. It's a really multi-layered question, Attila Bey. The thing is, you can say when Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar were being subjected to pogroms and ethnic cleansing, Turkey raised its voice and made a lot of noise. So why not for Uyghurs who are both Turks and Muslims? Well, that's called cynical foreign policy making. Turkey has a lot of interest in China, and the Chinese don't tolerate even a one word or a sentence that is critical of what they do in Xinjiang. And what they do in Xinjiang is culturicide, if you will. I don't want to say genocide, but they are definitely trying to erase or stain Uyghur identity, and it's a very repressive regime in Xinjiang that the Chinese authorities implement. Too much pressure on women, forcing them to marry Chinese men.
That's really, yeah.
Concentration camps, re-education camps, whatever. Okay. So Mr. Erdogan has always been interested in Palestine, and genuinely, because he is an Islamist, he believes that this is a honorable and maybe sacred cause. He is a lot closer to Hamas, which is, as I said, the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, and we know that the AKP's roots are pretty close to the Muslim Brotherhood, and we have and this government has been an ardent defender of Muslim Brotherhood almost everywhere in the Middle East where they are organized, and they have, especially in Egypt, they have even taken the risk of ruining Turkey's relations with Egypt in order to own up to the rights of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose government was actually thrown out by a pretty bloody military coup. So it's not surprising that Mr. Erdogan became very incensed and protested. But the thing is, one of our most famous proverbs is derdin üzüm yemek mi, bağcı dövmek mi? Is it the grapes you're after, or the excuse?
You want a good fight.
Okay. And the point is, if you really want to help the Palestinians, then you should have had an ambassador both in Egypt and in Israel. Yeah. Because if you don't have representation, you can try to call everyone, nobody will pick up the phone, or if they pick up the phone, you will only have small talk. When you're not in good terms with the countries like Egypt, that are neighbors to Gaza, and therefore have been primarily involved with that problem. And unless you have an ambassador in Tel Aviv so that you could actually speak to the Israeli authorities, to actually invite them to their senses, or to broker something between them and the Gazans and Hamas, then all your anger is basically for domestic consumption. I really do think that Turkey managed that crisis pretty badly. It didn't get anything out of its positions and out of its utterances. And not only that, in a moment of anger, when I think he went off script, President Erdogan lashed out American president and called him bloody-handed. The Americans didn't respond to that, but they responded to another part of his speech, which smelled of anti-Semitism, certainly for the Americans. And another proverb, attığın taş ürküttüğün kurbağaya değdi mi, was what it's basically suggesting is what you've done worth the price that you had to pay for
too
it.
much ado
And
for nothing.
I would say no. It was too much ado for nothing. Yeah, unfortunately. And by the way, look, Qatar and Egypt are at loggerheads because Qatar supports the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt obviously considers them a terrorist organization. And under US pressure, it was Qatar and Egypt that brokered it. And by the way, Qatar was paying the salaries of Hamas personnel in Gaza with full knowledge of the Israeli government. The Israeli government or Bibi Netanyahu had a tacit agreement with Hamas. We are totally oblivious to all those nuances in how things are actually managed in that conflict, and to try to present yourself as the knight on shining armor really only plays perhaps domestically, and even domestically I'm not quite certain that it delivered as many goods to the government as they may have expected.
Okay. By the way, this is a two-part interview. We're going to have Mr. Ozel again in our second part, but let's finish this with the following question. Since roughly the beginning of the year, Turkish diplomacy has a new focus. It's called reset or normalization with former rivals. And of course, Israel and Egypt, as well as Saudi Arabia, are on that list. Do you think Erdogan's abrasiveness during this crisis has hurt prospects for peace or new friendship with these partners? Or is it, do they not? You might say, well, they know Erdogan. This is how he is. They don't really care. What do you think?
I think it is safe to say that the reset with Israel will have to wait a bit.
Yeah.
And as far as the openings to Egypt and Saudi Arabia are concerned, I don't think we were getting anywhere. At any rate, reports suggested that we were not really getting anywhere, or if we were going to get anywhere, it was going to be very slow. And I think there too, we're paying the price of rather unwise moves, decisions of the past few years, 8 years for Egypt. And that is, you see, Turkey actually had a monopoly of genuine security relations with Israel.
Right.
Egypt had peace, but okay, their arrangements were containment of Hamas and stuff. And so between Israel and Arab states, Israeli, Greece and Cyprus in Eastern Mediterranean, and they never really had historically good relations. Yeah. And Turkey did not probably pay enough attention to the fact that the Gulf Arab countries in particular are most afraid of Iran, and the Palestinian issue is for them is secondary. And now, because of Turkey's abrasiveness, as you've said it, as you've called it, they're also wary of Turkey, and they're as concerned about what Turkey's intentions are in the Middle East as they are of Iran's. So the Abraham Accords did not just come because they remembered that they were cousins with the Jews, but because they are all scared. They are all scared of Iran, Iran's ambitions, Iran's power in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and they needed protection. They saw the United States actually slowly but surely leaving the region, making deals with Iran, or trying to make deals, trying to resurrect the JCPOA today, the nuclear agreement. And they wanted to feel more secure, and they thought Israel would actually provide them with that security. And secondly, because they themselves are now trying to engage with the world economy as it is evolving, and they want Israeli technology to help them. They are ready to invest in Israel and all that. So a combination of factors led them to make their peace. They all forgot that the Palestinian issue is always a burning issue. It may be quiet, but it would erupt, and it did erupt. And Turkey is left out of all those things, and the efforts to ameliorate relations, I think will not bear fruit for quite some time. And as I said with Israel, I suppose it'll take a lot longer.
Thank you, Mr. Soli Ozel. But I am, telepathic, as you know. You said Iran, Iran, Iran. I know you want to talk about Iran. I want to talk about Iran. And I want to tell our audience not to leave this. I don't know if this happens in YouTube, but simultaneously after this part, there will be a second part with Mr. Soli Ozel, our distinguished scholar, which will discuss Iran and United States rapprochement, if such a thing happens, as well as Turkey's relationship with Russia and the United States. But I want to thank him for enlightening me and possibly our audience, and wish him goodbye for this part of the show. We have just watched another episode of Real Turkey Channel with Atilla Yeşilara and Soli Ozel. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello again. You're at Real Turkey Channel, and this is Atilla Yeşilara for a second part of Turkish diplomacy with Mr. Soli Ozel. I already introduced him in the first part. He's a distinguished scholar who has spent a lot of thought and has done a lot of writing on Turkish foreign policy. In the first part, we have discussed the problem of Palestine with Israeli Jews. Today, we're going to move slightly northeast, I suppose, and discuss Iran and the United States. But first, let's say welcome to Mr. Soli Ozel once again, and my deepest gratitude to him for honoring us a second time in this show.
Thank you very much. Good to be back. The problem with Iran is not just concentrated on the nuclear deal, although that is the first item on the agenda. There is also the concerns of all the countries in the region, and that includes Turkey, which is rather hush-hush about that, of Iranian influence everywhere. You can probably not break Iranian influence in Iraq, but a deal in Syria will not be possible if Iran is going to be so strong there. And Iran is also very strong in Lebanon through Hezbollah, which is its creation. By the way, joint creation with Israel, because if it weren't for the Israeli invasion in 1982, Hezbollah might not have come about. So it's Iran's meddling in the affairs of Arab states that actually concern them quite a lot. But in Geneva, the talks are moving, and the problem is, okay, how much will Americans ease on their sanctions, and how much the Iranians must do immediately? There has not been an agreement yet, because the Biden administration is being bombarded by the right-wingers, Israel's allies, and the Republicans that were never happy with the original JCPOA. So it's room for maneuver for grand gestures, which are absolutely necessary to get the Iranian response. It's very narrow. Secondly, in Iran, almost exactly a month from now, on 18th of June, there will be presidential elections. And when you look at the lineup of who's going to be a candidate, if they can pass the Guardian Council's approval, these are all hardliners so far. There is no so-called moderate that actually has presented itself as a candidate. And therefore, even if the current government in Iran wants to move ahead because the Iranian economy is suffering, which means the Iranian people are suffering, there are a lot of very reluctant, important institutions within Iran, and I'm not sure that the decider in Iran, which is Ali Khamenei, the Rehber, the Vilayet Faqih, is really necessary to give a green light to any concessions on the part of Iran. Therefore, let's just wait and see. It is important that the Iranians have accepted, in principle, to renew a deal with IAEA so that IAEA could go and carry on inspections in Iran to make sure that everybody knows that the Iranians, even if they are at 63%, they're staying there and they're not really trying to move any further. But again, this will take a bit more time. And before the Iranian elections, I do not expect any agreement between the US and Iran. By the way, we haven't mentioned it, but it is related, I think, to those,
Sure.
to the
Hey,
Iranian
you are the boss. You know, just enlighten me, man.
Okay. Secretary Blinken has decided to visit the Middle East. I believe he will, I mean, I said that already, I'm sorry. He will also stop in Turkey. And I suspect that the agenda will not be just the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but if he goes to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and whatever, it will also be about Iran. Maybe he will brief them about what goes on in Geneva and see if some of the contacts could be taken further. It is already a major step that the Saudis acknowledged they were having talks with the Iranians. Because if that relation moves to a slightly more civilized point, it may actually facilitate an agreement. There, the problem is going to be Israel, because since the Biden administration came to power, Israelis sabotaged the nuclear reactors in Iran, have killed already over the course of years several important figures in Iran's nuclear program. And if there is a modicum of advance and some kind of an understanding between Gulf Arab states and Iran, Israel will be very unhappy about that, I suspect. And I guess part of the task of the American Secretary of State would be to tell the Israelis to stop doing all that and to undermine the efforts of the Biden administration. By the way, I was, along with everybody else, very critical of Biden's relative passivity and basically
indifference, maybe. Yeah.
No, it wasn't indifference. Well, Israel has a right to defend itself and all that, the usual lines. But we'll probably read the story sometime in the next couple of weeks. But it is quite obvious to me from reading the reporting and reading between the lines as well, that I think on his telephone calls with Bibi, he has been extraordinarily strong and harsh, especially the last two conversations when Bibi wasn't willing to stop the
bombing attacks.
But then Americans finally put all their weight, and then Qatar and Egypt managed to broker a deal. By the way, as a result of that, Bibi will probably remain prime minister. And I think that is one reason why this war actually took place. And Hamas probably gained because the PA proved itself to be totally ineffective as well.
Okay, let's move further north, since Iran needs to be aged a little bit more in the casket. Let's talk about Russia and Turkey. This is a relationship that really befuddles me.
You're not alone.
So I'm just trying to compress this to a single issue, which is the latest one. Why is Russia angry at Turkey, if it is? Is it because of Ukraine or is it because of Canal Istanbul?
Why is Russia what?
Angry.
Angry.
I suppose they are, because we're not getting any vaccines or tourists. And then, there's nothing else we want from Russia at this point.
Well, first of all, Turkey is now increasingly, and by the way, there is now, as we speak, just 1 second, a NATO exercise going on in the Black Sea.
Oh boy.
Romania, and Turkey is the steadfast defender, and Turkey is the leading country.
Right. Wow.
It used to be the case that Turkey in 1990s, Turkey and Russia would not let NATO or the Americans actually come to the Black Sea. And there were a lot of right-wing Americans that were very angry with Turkey for being so jealous of anybody else's presence in the Black Sea. At the time, Turkey had a stronger navy than Russia, by the way. From 2008 onwards, the balance of power between Turkey and Russia on the Black Sea has actually changed to Russia's advantage because, first of Georgia, And in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, virtually the Black Sea has turned into a Russian lake again. So everything that Turkey does in the Black Sea with the Americans, like refueling an American plane or taking the lead in a NATO exercise, that actually angers the Russians. The same thing is about the Ukraine. Turkey's relations with the Ukraine, the fact that Turkey will sell drones to the Ukrainians. What was it? Turks have talked about the Crimea and the Crimean publics and stuff, and the Russians yesterday. I read that preparing for your program, since I know you grill your guests relentlessly and pitilessly. And the Russians responded saying that, yeah, of course you have Kurds too, you know, like we have good relations with the Kurds. So it's a very interesting relation. I mean, it's like two partners that don't trust one another at all, but need one another for practical purposes, who are dancing without stepping on each other's thumbs. How long that can be, toes, I'm sorry, how long that can be continued.
Depends on how you dance, really. I'm sorry, go ahead. Don't bother to answer me.
No, I didn't hear your question.
Whether you step on someone's toes and thumbs during a dance depends on which dance you do, but don't bother to answer me. It was just
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I know that you're a choreographer too, so you would know.
Just move on, please.
Okay. And for any objective observer, despite all our rhetoric and our claims that we want to be strategically autonomous and all the problems we have because of S-400s, the purchase of S-400 missile system from Russia, Turkey's tilt towards the West on strategic matters within NATO is actually pretty obvious. Okay, and the Russians accepted the decision on S-400s may be a turning point in those relations as well. I mean, what you do with S-400s may turn to be a turning point, both in your relations with Russia and your relations with the United States.
Okay, let's fast forward the tape to 14th or 15th of June when Mr. Biden finally meets Mr. Erdogan. Will that be the subject of the NATO sidelines meeting? And what do you think would be the end game? Will Turkey mothball the S-400s or stand up against Biden? Then we can finish up with Russia. I know at your age, this has been a pretty long conversation for you. You need to rest.
Because I'm young?
Yeah, you have a short attention span.
Oh, I do have a short attention span. Okay. And I'm your guest, right, in your program. Okay. You'll get a surprise at the end. Anyway, look, the negative agenda on Turkish-American relations is pretty loaded. Therefore, that meeting is going to be important, but there is so much to talk about. There is so much mistrust. Then there is probably so much misunderstanding that one meeting cannot actually solve any of those problems. So I'm hoping and I'm assuming that behind the scenes, professionals are actually working to prepare the agenda, points of agreements, points of disagreements, what gestures each side wants from the other, because the two leaders, let's say, will have about an hour. Half of it is translation, okay? Yeah, and unless the professionals really prepare very tightly the agenda and the exact points of discussion, that may prove to be inconsequential. I mean, that may prove to be inconclusive. So the American president's hands are tied. There is a law now, and by the way, this shouldn't have come to that, but because Turkey no longer has any friends in Congress, and the Turkish government neglected Congress in my judgment, rather unwisely neglected Congress. There is a law now which makes it imperative that Turkey actually take the S-400s out of the country, out of
Yeah.
Turkish soil. How do you square that circle? You can't do that. You cannot re-export them either. So I don't know how you'll deal with that. Some creative, imaginative solution will have to be found. And if there is a search for it, I don't know. Because you can never know what the Turkish government thinks. One, we don't have really a functional media. There is so much misinformation, and the authorities responsible for communicating really basically miscommunicate more than they communicate anything. So we'll see. You know, constantly you have those news spreading that a second batch of S400s will be bought when you haven't really solved the first batch problems related to the first batch. I hope that Turkey will recognize two things. One, that that NATO summit is going to be paired with the G7 summit.
Right.
And if in those two summits, depending how they go, will actually tell us if there is something called a Western alliance that can be cohesive and can actually pursue policies coherently or not. Because much as everybody is angry with Turkey for not being a team player, Germany is not being a team player at all. I mean, Germans, in spite of the fact that the Biden administration asked them not to do so, pushed all the EU countries to sign the investment agreement with China. Secondly, they're not giving up on the Nord Stream 2, which for the Americans was anathema. In fact, a very respected analyst, Klein Rogoff of well, I forgot his name, the head of German Marshall Fund in Germany, who used to be an advisor to the previous German president, has written an article, a very important article entitled Biden's 100 Days of Solitude, claiming that he extended his hand and the Europeans missed the opportunity to hold it, particularly the Germans. So those two meetings, therefore, are going to tell us whether or not there will be a coherent and cohesive Western alliance that can actually agree on the most important matters, Russia, China, and all that. So Turkey will have to be mindful of that and will have to decide whether it wants to be part of that rearrangement of the Western alliance. Does it go there as a partner in the Western alliance, as a member of the Western alliance, or does it go there as the non-West, which many Westerners would also like to think about Turkey? And second, the bilateral issues, what about the S-400s? And for the Turks, of course, the PYD, YPG, it is not, in my judgment, it is not insignificant, and certainly it may well be symbolic prior to this meeting that the Americans have sent a team to talk to the leadership of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the nucleus, which is, of course, what Turkey considers a terrorist organization, that is the PYD. Okay, so at that level, and with President Erdogan calling Biden bloody-handed and then making all those remarks about how a Jewish prime minister of Israel told him how he enjoyed killing Palestinians, and the State Department responding very harshly to what they considered to be anti-Semitic statements and stuff. We're not really going to that meeting unless things calm down with Blinken's visit in the best of circumstances.
Right.
Okay, tempers are high and both sides are nervous. I hope that the Turkish side will be much better prepared than they had been for any other meeting in recent times when they go to that summit. Because personally, I think 2021 is an important year for Turkey to decide which side of the strategic divide it wishes to be on. Because if it makes that decision, it will also have to make decisions on your field. What do we do about the green economy? Right. Do we actually go forward with an updated customs union? What do we want? Are we going to be reasonably better managed than we have been in the past few years? All those questions, in my view, are related. And that really will be a function of Turkish decision on, are we strategically a Western country or are we not? To the extent that the West exists, I mean, one caveat perhaps is the interests of the countries that make up the West are not identical any longer because there is no common enemy, which is the Soviet Union. Russia doesn't quite cut it the same way because there is no ideological component to that
competition
entity, if you will. Okay, so we'll see. Maybe we'll have a shorter talk so you can actually keep your concentration on after the meeting.
Maybe we'll have another one after 15. Mr. Soli Ozel, I am extremely grateful for your time and enlightening remarks. Once again, this has been another broadcast of Real Turkey Channel. Attila Yeşilada with Mr. Soli Ozel, who's an expert on foreign relations and who has enlightened us on a range of issues from Israel versus Palestine to Iran to Russia and Turkey and United States. Thank you very much, Soli. I wish you a good day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And bye-bye, YouTubers. This is Attila Yeşilada saying goodbye from Istanbul.